Please be seated. I have always felt sorry for Lazarus in today's gospel. You know, Lazarus is the one who dies and everything. Now, I haven't actually felt sorry for him because he died. That's something that we all experience. We start off this whole season with Ash Wednesday. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So that's not what makes me feel sorry for him. And in truth, I don't really feel sorry for him that he comes back from death into life, even though I've known several people who have had near-death experiences, who've died on the operating table or something like that. And every one of them had said, man, I really didn't want to come back. But I came back because God said to come back. Because I had a purpose. I had a reason for coming back and something to do. So although I didn't really want to, I knew that's what I needed to do, and I was happy to do it. So I suspect, even though Lazarus was not just a near-death experience, I mean, he was dead 4 days. Jesus hung around, stayed away for a few extra days just to make sure that he was good and dead. That might have made it a little tougher to come back. But Lazarus came back probably for the same reason those who had the near-death experiences do. Because he understood that there was a reason, there was a purpose for him coming back. So I don't really feel sorry for him for that either. What I feel sorry for him for is that then he had to do it all over again. That he had to have a death after life. And if John is to be believed, in just the very next chapter, it says that the chief priests plotted to murder Lazarus because people were coming to Jesus on account of Lazarus. And it's one thing to die surrounded, from illness, surrounded by your loved ones. And it's another thing to face murder. So I feel badly for him that he had to go through this death after life. But as I look at him, that makes me wonder why so many of us choose that. Why so many of us choose death after life. And I don't mean physical death. I mean the kind of death that Paul was talking about in the epistle when he says, to set your mind on the flesh is to die. Even a lot of us who, after we have experienced the grace and the love of God and real joy in life, even then, somehow we fall into this thing where we set our minds on the flesh and we begin to die. And I wonder, why do we do that? And part of the reason is, we're human, and none of us is ever immune to that setting our minds on the flesh. Now, you might ask yourself, why does Paul call this death? But in order to sort of understand that, you have to first understand what it is that makes life good and worth living. And I'll bet if you just take a moment to think about what makes your life good and worth living, I'm going to bet that at least for some, or maybe most, or maybe all of us, that a couple of different things are going to pop into mind. Family and friends. The beauty of God's creation. And this impulse that is within each of us to create something. We all have this creative impulse. Those three things, and maybe more, but they all lead to one thing. And that is the one who creates and loves all of this, to God. That's what makes life worth living. But when we set our minds on the flesh, then people become objects to use and abuse. In the creation, the earth becomes just a resource to be exploited. And violence becomes a reasonable means to a dubious end. When we set our minds on the flesh, all those things that make life good and worth living begin to slip away. They begin to become less and less a part of who we are. And we die inside. That's something that you may not think about all the time, but I guarantee it's never far from our minds. It's always just under the surface. Real quick example. Yesterday, I spent up at the Kiwanis Ice Arena in Saugerties at a Coaches Against Cancer hockey tournament. It was all day long. And in the course of that, by the way, if I start to ache and moan and groan, that's because it was all day long. But at a tournament like that, you spend a lot of time in the locker room between games. And I mean a lot of time. And usually it's typical locker room talk. Most of it centered around who was being traded from this team and why this team was doing so badly through the year. And literally, they would talk about this for hours, and it's boring. But then I heard three guys talking about something else, and it really caught me. Because they were sitting in a corner discussing the nature of violence and why people resort to violence. And the conversation turned to the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, and then to a comparison of them with the Japanese-American internment camps in America during World War II. And then to the use of the atomic bomb. And all I did was listen. Because what I was hearing was the sense of, why is this part of who we are? And this is a bunch of guys who had just gotten off the ice beating each other up. But it was a serious, deep, philosophical conversation. And it shows to me that we are never far from this. It is always just underneath the surface. Why are we always focused on the flesh, and why do we allow it to kill us? That's what Paul's asking. And then we're not talking physical death. We know that lies in store for all of us. But within life, why do we allow that death to creep into our very souls? Fortunately for us, unlike physical death, this sort of death is something that we can do something about. It is something that we can back away from. It's not easy. It's never been easy. But Paul does give sort of a first step in this. He says, to set your minds on the flesh is death, but to set your minds on the Spirit is life and peace and joy. And you might have to ask yourself, well, what does that mean to set your life on the Spirit? That's a tricky thing. But it starts off by looking at what makes life good and worth living. Because it is in the eyes of the person sitting next to you that you will see God. And it is in looking at the sunset over the river, or in the mountains, or in the plains, that you will see God. And it is inside, in that creative impulse where we get invited to be part of the creation, to make beauty, to make life, that there is God. And the Spirit directs all of those things. And when we focus on the Spirit, then we can see these things much more clearly. And we can see that the things of the flesh, which Paul says are, money, power, position, vengeance, and maybe perhaps escapism. And by escapism, I mean, preferring to avoid the real world in front of us, and so hiding from them in lots of different intoxicating things, like hobbies or of course, drugs and violence and sex and all those sorts of things. Those are death. Focusing on the Spirit allows us to see life, allows us to see God in all of these things, allows us to see who we are as children of God. Now, one thing is important to know. Focusing on the Spirit does not change our outward circumstances one bit. The world is going to be just as screwed up now as always. There's going to be just as much crazy stuff in the news when you focus on the Spirit as when you don't. The difference is that that's never been the main point in life. The main point in focusing on the Spirit has never been to change the outward experiences, although when we follow Christ, we will work toward that. But rather, focusing on the Spirit changes us inside, because death starts from the inside out. But so does life. And just as surely as there is death after life, the story of Lazarus teaches us that there is always, always life after that. Amen.